Ooh, yeah. Oh, hey y'all, welcome back. It's Weekly Wonder, Season 2, Episode 5. And so since it's spring now, we're starting to see a lot of the signs of spring that we saw last year. The birds singing, flowers popping up. We're seeing all of these things happen at about the same time. So that got us thinking about patterns. So this week's activity is going to be about finding patterns.
And you can do this activity by yourself or with a family member.
Ooh.
Or with a pattern partner.
Ooh. Or like more than one person?
More than one person. You can do this activity by yourself or with others.
Like a pattern posse? Nice. So for today's activity, all you're going to need is your journal, something to write with, and then if you really want to go deep, you can bring a ruler, measuring tape, anything you can use to measure and get down and really analyze your pattern. So we and the rest of the Weekly Wonder team went to a park in Maryville to do this activity, but you can do it just about anywhere. So the first part of this week's activity is to find a pattern. So what is a pattern? A pattern is a shape or a structure or a behavior or an event that is repeated over and over. By observing patterns, we can infer or figure out some kind of rule or guiding principle behind what we're observing. We can also use patterns to make predictions about the things that we're observing.
So out there are all kinds of patterns. There's no telling like what you're going to find. See if you can spot the pattern here.
Ooh, yeah. Ooh, yeah. Ooh, yeah.
All right, think you got the pattern? What do you predict the next step will look like?
Ooh, yeah.
Nailed it.
So that was pretty easy. But every pattern isn't always necessarily the exact same thing repeated over and over. It might be that you find a pattern that one step is just a little bit different than the one before it, and then the next one is just a little bit different than the one before that. But as long as you can still tell that there's some sort of rule or guiding principle behind it, still got yourself a pattern.
All right, so let's try this again.
Ooh, yeah. Ooh, ooh, yeah. Ooh, 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 yeah.
All right, how about now? Think you got this one? Let's see.
Ooh, 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 yeah.
Nice.
So there are all different kinds of patterns. Here are a few different ones.
Emily and I first noticed a back and forth flowing pattern to the creek. Meanwhile, Tyler and Logan noticed that along the banks of the creek there was a pattern of sticks and leaves and other debris left around the base of shrubs, and concluded they must have been left there by a recent flood. You may also find patterns that have symmetry, and these are shapes that when divided in half contain two pieces that are mirror images of each other. Spiral patterns wrap around and around inside themselves. They're really good for fitting a whole lot of stuff in a small space, such as in a closed fist, which of course should only be used for friendship purposes. Another great pattern can be seen in trees, whose trunks split off into limbs, which then split off into even smaller branches, which then split off into twigs, which eventually split again into leaves. And then those leaves even have veins that split off into even smaller veins. This type of pattern is called a fractal, but I have a hard time holding on to this word, so I like to call them branchies.
Another really wild thing about patterns is that sometimes you'll find a pattern that's actually made up of smaller patterns. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Take this millipede, for example. Notice that every individual leg repeatedly moves in an up, forward, and down pattern. So there's one. But then this motion is repeated by every leg in order, forming a wave pattern that moves from the back to the front of the millipede. So that's a pattern of patterns. But then these waves repeat over and over as the millipede moves forward, making a pattern of patterns of patterns. But then, because the millipede is symmetrical, this action is mirrored on the other side, making a pattern of patterns of patterns of patterns. So if you were to find another millipede moving the same way, you would have found a pattern of patterns of patterns of patterns of patterns. Okay, so as you can tell, this can get pretty wrinkly. But don't worry, you only need to go as deep as the folds of your brain will allow.
So the second part of this week's activity is to find a pattern that you have found reflected somewhere else.
So if you're doing this activity with others and you found different patterns, you can swap journals and go and try to find their pattern.
Now it's possible you'll find your pattern repeated somewhere you would expect, like finding the same kind of leaf on a different tree. But it's also possible that you'll find your pattern reflected somewhere completely out of left field.
For example, that same back and forth flowing pattern that Emily and I found in the creek, Logan and Tyler found in the bark of a tree.
Flow. Ooh, look at the flow. So you might find that your pattern is broken, or that there are exceptions to your pattern, and that's okay.
Yeah, in fact, that brings us to our next step, which is to find an exception or a disruption. Because often, when we find a pattern disrupted, that's a clue that there's something else going on. Maybe something fishy, something wrinkly.
For example, Tyler and Logan found the branching pattern of a cedar tree interrupted by this orb with orange tentacles. No, seriously, what? And then they kept finding them over and over, and only in cedar trees. So that's a pattern of disruptions of a pattern. And then this happened.
So, not only are there some up here, but then there's a spot that breaks the pattern because they're like fruit things. But then check out, there's orange on right there.
Oh yeah.
It looks like the exact color of orange, but it's growing on a branch instead of a fruit.
Right, and the structures are a little different.
So that's a disruption of a pattern of disruptions.
So we've been focusing a lot on patterns in nature, but there are also a lot of human-made structures that reflect patterns that are originally found in nature. So if you find a pattern in a human-made structure, that's still good too. All right, y'all, so that's it for this week's episode. Get out there, take your journals, take your pencils, see what kind of patterns you can find.
We had a lot of fun finding patterns, getting outside, enjoyed each other's time, paying attention to nature. So get outside, look at some patterns, and share with others. And have fun, of course.
Of course. Patterns.
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 All right, y'all, thanks for watching. Get out there, find a pattern, see if you can find it again, and then see if you can find it disrupted. You can email us your journal entries at weeklywonder@gsmit.org. And join us next Tuesday for Tremont Tuesday.
It sounds like what you're saying is that we need to pick and prove our patterns in our patterned pairs prior to parlaying with the other patterned posse.
Beautiful.